K-12 school for about 15 years, and then I went into the university world.
I'm sorry, but you need to...
Oh, yeah, I have to be, but I'm probably in. From the camera's point of view, I probably was in the box. So I'm Stephanie Slater. Like I said, I taught K-12 science for 15 years in a variety of different public school settings. Then I went to graduate school. My PhD's in cognitive science, but I've done most of my work in the field of studying how people learn science, particularly astronomy. I even married one. I married an astronomer. So it's up close. It's Piaget and research technology, up close and in your house. So Tim's an astronomer, and he has spent the last 30-something years doing astronomy education. So you can imagine that as we came in as retired people into the classical Christian education world, which from this moment forward will heretofore be referenced as the community, because classical Christian education is a mouthful, nobody was more excited about being part of this community than we were. Because in the regular schooling world, astronomy is sort of relegated to the backwoods, right? So to be in a community of people who are going to be super excited about teaching astronomy and teaching it from a mathematical perspective, as a mathematical art, are y'all satisfied back there? Teaching it as a mathematical art, nobody's more thrilled. I've personally spent 20 years going all over the world trying to get people to teach astronomy as a verb rather than something you read out of an encyclopedia. So I look at this and I think, these are my people. Once we started our school, though, and we started to look into this community framework, which we adore and which we think is good and true and beautiful, the trivium just seemed to flow for us. It all makes sense. It hangs neatly off of its foundational documents. But we couldn't really understand how the Quadrivium was put together. Because, as I say, it's a mathematical liberal art. But I've spent my entire career trying to get people to teach astronomy as a mathematical endeavor. And that is a really big uphill fight. So super excited to figure out what it was that you guys had figured out that the rest of the world hadn't. And then we really struggled with the idea of music as a liberal art. And when I say music as a liberal art, I don't mean an endeavor that applies math. Because that's not a mathematical art, that's an application, right? Can we see the distinction there? Right, there are lots of things in the world where I use arithmetic, but those aren't mathematical arts, they're just applications. So before Tim figured out that being a music major was really hard and switched over to physics, he was a music major, he plays the saxophone. And I play several instruments as well. I've been playing music a long time. And I certainly did not know how to teach music as a mathematical endeavor, right? And I had the sense as I was saying the words that I was sort of lying. And I mean lying in the strictest, being strict with my self-discipline kind of way. I was saying things that weren't true. So we started reading. We read everything. We've got the Green Book. We call this the Green Book in our house, the liberal arts tradition. We read the Green Book. We watched every talk. We read every paper. We started going back and reading the original classical documents again. I had not read Aristotle's On the Heavens in a very long time. When I was young, I was just enthralled with how wrong he was with everything. And now as an older person, I'm super impressed with what he got right. But he didn't have good reasons in either case. As we went and we read all that and we listened to people, we had this sense that we'd kind of acquired over many years of doing a lot of education projects. And that is that a lot of words were happening, but the words didn't mean anything. You know what I'm saying? So Tim and I have different words for this. Tim says that they are vague. Right? We can listen to a series of talks on the liberal arts, and there's one on grammar, one on logic, one on rhetoric, and then there's two kind of squishing together, two of the Quadrivium, but half the time spent talking is talking about what they did over the summer vacation. It's like squished into nothing. They have nothing to say about it, but lots of words, and I don't know what the words mean. I mean, I went to MIT, I've got a degree in mathematics, and I have never taught multitudes and magnitudes in my life. I had no idea what anybody was talking about. And I have the sense that they don't really know what they're talking about either. Because if you know a lot about math and you are strictly wedded to the notion of separating out multitudes and magnitudes, you're not going to get very far. It's tough to do fractions that way. You cannot do calculus that way. And if you're not getting to calculus, you're not getting to the good stuff, right? That's where the beauty really happens. So try to do calculus without mixing up counting and real numbers. It's not happening. So Tim says vague. He also says word salad. I talk about people trying to use their Jedi mind tricks on me. When we're not running the school, we have a little side hustle that we do, and we, over collectively about 70 years in science education, we have written, read, reviewed, or revised about 10,000 academic products between us. And it's probably not exactly 10,000, but we're in the astronomy field, so. See, those people would not have gotten that at all. So that's a lot of experience, and after a while, you just get a gut sense for things, right? When a student turns in a paper and they've plagiarized it, you know before you go Grammarly it, don't you? Because after a while, your gut just tells you. And our gut is the same way for what makes a project hold together. As Christians, the first thing that makes us hold a project together is we have to know what's first. And for us, at our school, in our lives, it's God first and God only. Am I on the right slide? Yeah. And what that means is that the concept of Christian classical education serves that, not the other way around. So if I have to ditch this community in order to do what I have to do for God, that's what I'm going to do. Liberal arts, the same thing. Trivium, if it's got to go, it's got to go. And the quadrivium, if I have to tear it apart and make it another trivium that's about math, that's what I'll do if it serves God, because I'm not a slave to the quadrivium. So when I look at it that way and I put it together with our experience as project reviewers, we know we have to seek out the transcendent because that's where God is, but that's not very helpful, right? That's not like a way to get us through the haze of what's going on. So we went back to that original mind frame, that original framework that we have for projects that work. And all projects have two things in common. One, they're worth doing. The juice is worth the squeeze, right? They are beautiful. Their end products will be good. They will help a student seek out the beautiful and the good, right? And they've got a good return on investment. We're of limited resources. I'm only one person. I have to do what's going to get me to where I want to go. That is all easy and lovely. The second part is that they all have to be truthful, and that is very difficult. And I've seen this same pattern work out. It doesn't matter if I'm dealing with a kindergartner who's trying to count galaxies in the Hubble Deep Field, or if I'm dealing with a very important astronomer working on a very important telescope on a very important mountain. It doesn't matter all the little things you do. What makes your project good is whether or not you've got the guts to be truthful about it. Truthfulness in academic projects takes three things. The first is that you have to actually know your foundations because you don't have any original ideas. Those are very hard to come by. You are building on the shoulders of hobbits, as some say, right? So, do you know that original literature, and are you synthesizing it correctly? Are you making meaning out of it in a way that actually reflects what it would have meant to the people it was written to begin with, right? In this way, those of us coming out of a Christian tradition where we're pretty serious about Scripture, we have a leg up on other people because we know what it means to look at something in the context in which it was written. The second thing is, are you ready to jettison your presuppositions, your preconceptions? If you are so wedded to teaching Ptolemy in your astronomy class that you just can't conceive of not teaching Ptolemy, then you've got preconceptions that are going to get in the way of you doing what you've got to do. And the last thing, which seems so simple and people just throw this away, is that you have to be extraordinarily rigid about your definitions being correct, which is different than being precise or accurate, because correct means you are representing that true value, not an accurate, as close as you can get to true, but the true value. And we're not trying to be precise either because we don't want our darts hitting the wall, right? How many of you have done the DART thing? Right? Okay, you know what I'm talking about. So, can we do this? All right, before we do that, I would like to take a second to just back up and address why this is not a problem in the trivium, but it is in the quadrivium. Right? They're smooth. But in the quadrivium, we've got problems they don't have to deal with, okay? The first is that when we go back to the classical period, we've caught the literary arts and the mathematical arts in two very different stages of development. Logic, as Aristotle taught it, and logic as you might teach it today in your school are not that different. Biology or astronomy as taught back then and astronomy as taught now are not even in the same category of things, right? It has changed. What we know has changed so much. If Ptolemy were here, he wouldn't teach Ptolemy because he's like, that's wrong. He would know, right? So we have to be willing to understand that. The other thing is that, like I say, they develop differently. The whole point of logic is that it's eternal, right? It goes throughout time. It's not supposed to change a lot. In the mathematical arts, we are supposed to change. And that's ironic because math is unchanging. Right? I like that. God's funny that way. We also have this problem of the quadrivium being divergent. If I go back in time and I look at the schools of thought of logic in the classical era, they would differ by opinion, yes? But logic is logic. It's kind of this thing. If I go back and I look at arithmetic in 400 BC, I got about 5 different things that are called, that we call arithmetic, that are not the same thing at all. So which one are you talking about now? Are you talking about arithmology or are you talking about logistics? Because those aren't the same beasts. One is of the occult and one is of God. So which one are you adopting as your foundational documents? Okay? And that brings us to the next thing. Although people say words to try to cast spells, the quadrivium wins hands down when it comes to being related to occultic practices. They don't say the Pythagorean cult just on a whim. They meant it. And when you then say that you're adopting this framework that comes from the Neo-Pythagoreans, you should wonder how that cult might have influenced those ways of thinking, right? And the final thing, again, is that definitions morph. When we talk about number, what number are you talking about? Because Nicomachus's number is not my number. And we think something as fundamental as number doesn't change its meaning, but it's not even the same beast, right? So we got to check all of those things at the door, and we have to forgive ourselves. There's not something inherently wrong with the mathematical arts that the quadrivium is maybe a little less developed. It's the nature of the beast. So what we decided to do for us is to pull it all apart and to first ask ourselves, how truthful were we being with ourselves? Because on our website and in our words, we would talk to our parents about teaching music, for instance, as a mathematical endeavor, as a mathematical art, and we're not. 10% of our instructional time is dedicated to teaching music because we really believe in the value of doing that. But we're not teaching as a mathematical art. And when we say those words, we're not being truthful. Yikes. I'm lucky that my head of school is married to me. If you say that to your head of school, you're going to get slant eye cast at you, right? But I can say that. We are not being truthful. Were we teaching astronomy as a mathematical art? Very tough to do. There are very few people on the planet Earth who currently do astronomy as a mathematical endeavor. The idea that you're having your 5th graders do it is probably not very truthful. So, what texts are we building upon? Are they appropriate? Are we thinking about them correctly? Are we willing to stand here in front of you guys and say that we're jettisoning a part of the quadrivium and lose your good favor? Or do we want your good favor? We have to think about those things. And then we've got to clean up our definitions because they're a hot mess. So let's look at that. So, liberal arts. What exactly is one? We should probably start with that if we're even going to go on talking about the quadrivium. So, if we mention somebody's work For the most part, it means that we hold it in such high regard that we believe it is worth contending with, okay? So there's no disrespect, and everything I've written is flawed. So that happens. There's still love there. But the first thing we did was we picked up what we call the Green Book, the liberal arts tradition, right? And I think a lot of you have this. We have it on our website. We encourage parents to read it as an introduction to the liberal arts tradition. So we just went through. I went through, because it's the thing I do, and we found every definition for the liberal arts in this book, every unique definition for the liberal arts in this book, anything that might tell us what a liberal art is. And it's like this. You don't read it. It's not intended for you to read. It's just a lot. And you can see I stopped at page 58 because I figured I had saturated the data set. I was good at this point. But there were things in here that, to me, cannot be part of a definition. They have to be justified after the definition is given. For instance, 7. Why has it got to be 7? If you're not into numerology, that shouldn't be important to you. The people who came up with 7 were, by the way, into numerology. So that can't be there. Seeds and tools. That is a beautiful metaphor to use for the liberal arts. But metaphors don't belong in definitions. What do you mean by seed and tool? You know what I'm saying? Some of them I thought, wow, we really need to have a talk about these because you've got to convince me. The liberal arts are tools by which all knowledge is justified. Nope. I'm going to argue you on that. That is not correct. That's a tough statement to throw out there. Or only liberal arts produce knowledge and science. No, I don't think so. So we thought it was strange that in a book called The Tradition of the Liberal Arts Tradition, that there was not a clear definition of the liberal arts. So we had to come up with one for ourselves, and we think that each of you should do that for yourself too, because we're not somebody that you should just believe. You have to wrestle with these things for yourselves. But we needed a clear definition. For us, the liberal arts are fundamental subjects that provide knowledge and skills to be used in other studies. We think that for us, each part of this definition is required to differentiate a liberal art from all kinds of other things. I don't know, starting off, how many there are. And I'm not alone in that. Over the last couple thousand years, there have been some pretty smart people who have wondered what should be considered a liberal art and how many there should be. So it is up for debate, all right? For the purposes of our school, the intention of the liberal art instruction is to direct the students' affections to God. So anything that doesn't goes. And it doesn't matter how much I like teaching that thing. It's got to go. All right, so then, of course, you know, what we had to do is we had to say, well, what's the quadrivium? Again, in the book, we came up with these three definitions. These 4 liberal arts were mentioned. Other people in other times, some really smart people, Seneca, Augustine, they have disagreed with this list. So if I disagree with it, I'm in good company. You know? It also said it's a mathematical art and the 4 arts of number. And you might think, well, mathematical art, numerical art, that's the same. No, it's not. And math is about getting it just right. Not almost, but getting it right. So mathematical is a much better definition. Geometry people would like to show up to the party too, you know? So we said the quadrivium, in quotes, because we don't really know that that should be the right name if we don't go with 4. The quadrivium is a collection of mathematical liberal arts, and we've already defined a liberal art, so we're good. In particular, for us at our school, in our application, there are 3 things that we use to determine whether or not something should be included in the curriculum, because there is the whole universe included in the mathematical liberal arts. So how do we winnow that down? First, the students have to acquire skills that will allow them to explore and to understand the harmony and the order of God's creation. So these are things that they have to be able to do when they get done with it. If they just know all the names of the planets and they know all the things in an astronomy course, that's not going to get them there. They have to have acquired skills that they didn't pick up in mathematics or in arithmetic or geometry. The second thing is that they have to develop abstract reasoning that they can then employ in all these different things. And the third is that they will be better equipped to serve their God. that means that there has to be something usable in it. We're not just all going to sit around and talk about math all day long. We got to be able to use it to do something. Okay, so we said, well, that's fine. We don't have time to talk about all four of the potential mathematical arts at this time. Let's just pick one and let's do the easy one. Let's start with arithmetic, right? Because we all know what that is. So in the Green Book, it says on page 69 that arithmetic is perceiving and relating discrete number. And I read that out to Tim, and he looked at me, and I just started laughing because he said the exact same thing that I said the first time I read it. He said, perceiving, that's interesting. What's that supposed to mean in this case? And I said, I know, right? I said the exact same thing. So what I want to know is, because this is a definition, what exactly do we mean when we say that? Right? Because I'm going to say this to my parents. I have to know what it means. So does it mean something like this? That the person can look at 6 objects and say, that's 6 objects. That's 6 pretty parrots, or that's 6 pretty beach things. Is that what I mean when I say perceived number? She's nodding yes, and I nod yes too, because I think that that's what that means. Does it mean this? That I see the number 6 and I perceive that that is associated with a multitude of 6 objects somewhere out there in the universe. And that seems like the first thing, but it's not. Those are 2 different cognitive skills, which is why you got to teach it both ways. So I like that one, and I would say, yeah, I think that's perceiving. Or does it mean something like this? That I look at the number 6 and I perceive that within the number 6, the 6 contains things. The 6 can be divided into halves, thirds, and sixths, which gives me 3, 2, and 1. And when I add 3, 2, and 1, I get back 6. That makes 6 a perfect number. The first one. Does anybody know the second one? Once you know, you're going to start seeing advertisements everywhere. What's the next one? It's 28. You see Rolex. Every Rolex ad has a 28 on the date. Isn't that weird? Why is that? Why did they do that? By the way, 6 is the perfect number, and if you get 6 times 6, if you square 6, you get 36, which is the first circular number. If you go 6 times 6 times 6, do you know what you get? 216. Yeah, there you go. You get 216, which is the first spherical number, which is very important because Pythagoras believed that 1, the unity, was a spherical entity, right? So spherical numbers are the number of God. 6 times 6 times 6. How weird is that? I wonder if that's ever going to pop up in our culture. Or does it mean this? Now, I didn't put all the pages on here. I know you're going to count them. There are 10 pages in the Theology of Arithmetic, which is the follow-up to Nicomachus's Introduction to Arithmetic. There are 10 pages explaining to you the meaning of the number 6. And if you were an educated individual, you would know these things. So for instance, number 6, it arises out of the first even and odd numbers, male and female, as a product and by multiplication. Hence, it's called androgynous. It's also called marriage. In the strict sense that it arises not by addition, as the pentad does, obviously, but by multiplication. Moreover, it's called marriage because it is equal to its own parts, and it is the function of marriage to make offspring similar to its parents. If you were a well-educated person 2,500 years ago and you had taken arithmetic with Pythagoras, you would know this. This is important, which is why Pythagoras was only concerned with whole numbers, and actually only the numbers between 1 and 9, which are called discrete numbers. That's when he's talking about the study of the multitudes, he's only talking about those 9 numbers. Is that what I'm going to base my math on in my school? I don't think so. I'm not teaching that. So when I say I am, I'm not speaking truth. And wherever I don't speak truth, God cannot bless me. I will not find order and harmony in spaces where I don't have the guts to say the truth. So, Here's the 4 things I just showed to you. Assigning a quantity to a symbol, assigning that symbol to a quantity, recognize the number of parts of a number, and recognizing the inherent intrinsic mystical meaning in every number. If you like the first 2, and me in the front row do, we like modern arithmetic. Those of you heathens who like the last 2, get out of here, classical arithmetic people. No, no, no. And the last thing we had to say is, what in the world is a discrete number? I've been around the block. I know my math. I know all kinds of numbers. And here's a nice, beautiful chart. Do you see discrete on there? So what are you talking about? No. You can't just go making up new kinds of numbers unless you explain what they are. And unfortunately, they do not go on to explain what it means. And they're really nice people. And I suppose they are. I don't actually know them. I bet they're really nice people. And my work has got flaws in it. And I get emails from people all the time telling me that I've got the wrong, weight for Jupiter on page 127 in my textbook, and please fix it. I understand. I'm not trying to hurt them. So I went back and I looked at this whole multitudes and magnitudes thing, and I called people and we emailed people and we asked people and we watched all the videos, and nobody can tell me a good reason why my Christian children need to strongly differentiate between multitudes and magnitudes. If you know what spiritual good, what closeness to God will be achieved by my students separating out multitudes from magnitudes, call me, email me, and I'm willing to learn. But when people say arithmetic is the multitudes and geometry is the magnitudes, I just think that is super silly, and you're not getting far with that. Also, Pythagoras wouldn't have liked that. The mixing of the two, and he'd have thrown you off the side of the boat. No. So instead, we're going to go to our great surprise with Aristotle, who we don't think of as being a very mathematically inclined person. But if you go back and read categories, you can see he's trying to soften the debate back in the classical era, and he's just like, look, we're just going to talk about quantity. It can be discrete. It can be continuous. Don't care. All the same. Work the problems. All right? So we're going to go with Aristotle on this. But I do not think that anybody in here should believe us. You should not believe me. You don't know me. I could just be talking. I think that if you teach mathematical arts in a Christian classical school, you are intellectually obligated to go back and read the source documents that you say you're using as the basis for your instruction. If you don't, you're not being very intellectually rigorous or honest. You have to. And as it turns out, you can read it over lunch. It's super easy. If we go back to the Green Book, they say one of the oldest and most imitated texts from the ancient world is De Arithmetica, which translates into Introduction to Arithmetic. It was written by, and I slaughter his name. I don't speak Greek. I apologize. Nicomachus? Is that right? Am I doing okay? Okay, Nicomachus in the 1st century. While much of the text would look familiar to an elementary teacher or student, its differences are also striking. Nicomachus introduces the skills of arithmetic and subtraction, and even has a multiplication table that runs up to 10 by 10 beyond the 4 basic operations. It also discusses elementary sequences and series and investigates fractions as a part of division. Does anybody go, ooh? My teacher senses are perking up there. No. And again, this isn't for you to read, and it's hard for me to even read, but here's the contents of it. It's preamble for 6 chapters. Chapter 7 starts with evens and odds, which was very, very, very important to the Pythagoreans, right? Because harmony can only be achieved by the merging of opposites. So you must know all the things in the universe that are even and all the things in the universe that are odd. And that's the whole game plan here. So there are even time even evens and even time odd evens and odd time even evens, and don't confuse them. There are primes, there are secondaries, composites and relative primes. There's superabundance, deficients, and perfect numbers. 6 is 1, yeah. Multiple superparticulars, sesquialters, sesquitertian numbers, superpartidians, multiple superparticulars. I don't even know. And for each kind, there's a formula given for how you calculate them, and there's a list of the first 10 or so of the species, which is not an introduction to addition. It kind of presupposes addition. I have math equations in my textbooks too, but that doesn't mean I'm introducing arithmetic or anything else. And so here's that 10 by 10 multiplication table. It is a group of numbers that happens to be 10 by 10, but that's not its purpose at all. As you can see, the second row is the double of the first row, and the third row is the triple of it. The fourth is the quadruple of it, which you probably knew, which makes good sense. The third row is the sesquialter of the second row. In general, any row is a superparticular of the row above it, clearly and objectively. The multiples proceed as a notion, the superparticulars as they involve the first row. Hallelujah. Good grief. So we went through, and none of this is true. I have never seen any of that stuff. If any of that is familiar to an elementary school teacher or student, I'll eat my shoe. It's not true. It doesn't introduce any of the mathematical functions, and it certainly doesn't talk about fractions, because a neo-Pythagorean would have never engaged in the notion of a fraction. There are only ratios. And if you try to give me a number that is not some ratio of whole numbers, I will throw you off the boat, right? So this is not a foundation for arithmetic. This is a foundation for arithmology. And you can find this book, which is the follow-up to Nicomachus's Introduction to Arithmetic. It's not his theology of arithmetic, because most of that was lost. But his good friend Iamblichus copied it all down and added a few bits in, and you can go through and read it. It's arithmology, which is the precursor, one of the forms anyway, of numerology, is what's being taught in these books. And we're not going to teach that at our school. Y'all can do as you please, but we're not teaching it at our school. Excuse me. So, are there better foundations that we can build upon? Yes, there are. Unfortunately, that foundation that we want to build upon is something that, I don't read Greek. Does anybody read? I can sound it out because I know the letters. Anybody just read it? I think it says logistics or something in the ballpark of logistics. There's hardly any literature left from the classical era on logistics, which is what we would normally call arithmetic. There's nothing left because, as they say, why would you write about children's work, right? So we don't have that. But we do have the descendants of logistics. We have Descartes. We have Newton. We have these things. And none of those things were based on arithmology, although we should say Kepler and Galileo and even Newton dabbled in divination quite a bit. But they were men of their time. What can you say? So in our world at our school, arithmetic is going to be the study of quantity. And we don't care what kind of quantity it is. If it's a quantity, we're studying it. We're going to start with logistics mathematics, just like they did 2,500 years ago, even going back before that. We're not going to teach it the way they did because we don't have the same kind of numeric symbols that they had. It wouldn't work out very well. And we've got number symbols now that we can add with where we don't need pebbles. So if we do calculus, it's going to be the kind where we differentiate things. It's not going to be the kind that involves playing in the dirt. A little calculi for the pebbles, right? We're not doing that. We're going to go right through logistics, and we're going to study quantities through calculus because that's where the beauty is. And if somebody here needs to work on, a special needs version of calculus, how can we pull out the most beautiful of that so every one of our kids can get to it? Everything we teach is going to be to help our students better know and serve our God, our orderly God, because he reveals himself through the order of the numbers. So when we looked at the rest of the trivium, we asked ourselves three questions. The quadrivium. Does it teach its own mathematical art? Not, does it apply a mathematical art? Because that does not make it a liberal art. That makes it a science, yes? So are we going to be, I can't speak for anyone else, but when I speak the words, I have to speak the truth because I think God's only going to bless me if I do. If something is not teaching me a mathematical art that I can use in other arts, it's not a liberal art. That's the truth of it. And in the end, does everything I teach direct the student to God? If I use those two filters, I should be fine, right? So in geometry, what are we going to do? Well, Euclid didn't dabble in the occult quite as much as the other folks did. And so his work has turned out to have a lot of staying power, and we're going to go with that, right? What do they say? Second only to the Bible and the number of translations and editions that it's gone through. There's something to that. One cannot say the same for the works that we were citing when we were talking about arithmetic. There's like one translation of that theology of arithmetic. It's hiding, and that's probably a good thing. We're going to study geometry is the study of space and shape. We're no mention of continuous number. What are we talking about there? Nobody knows what those words mean. They're just speaking clear, clean English. Our students are going to study shape and size. They start it in the preschool, and we're going to continue through proofs, conic sections, trigonometry, all the things that have to do with understanding space and shape. That's for us. For music, we had to be willing to be more bold, as you might have guessed. If we look at Barker, who's probably done the best work on Greek's conceptions of music, he says that the Pythagoreans were not typically interested in the study of music for its own sake, right? For them, it was the researches that they did arose out of a conviction that the universe is orderly, that the perfection of a human soul depends on its grasping and assimilating itself to that order that they had found. Well, I'm not teaching that. In my school, the perfection of your soul depends upon you grasping and reaching out for the Lord my God, not after their conception of the mathematics of the harmonics of the universe, right? So they had three kinds of music. I think probably a lot of you know. The music of mundana, which was the music of the spheres, the music of the universe, the music that the harmonies that resonated through everything, the harmonics of things. That has not played out very well with additional data collection. Right? Even poor Kepler, I'm glad he kept at it. He kept trying to find the music of the spheres, but he kind of found some wonky tunes that nobody would consider musical. It was good effort, though, and he came up with 3 laws that we found to be useful. The music of humana, we're not teaching that. The notion that the internal workings of your body have resonances and harmonies, and if you get them in alignment with each other, that your body and your soul will be aligned with the universe. No, not teaching that. So that leaves us with just music. If we go back and read what they were teaching, if we go back and read Capella and Cassiodorus and all these kind of guys as to what was actually in the curriculum for teaching music, even into the Middle Ages, we're not teaching that. You would probably need to be at a music conservatory majoring in music theory, studying number theory, and then studying an obscure text of number theory to teach what they were teaching in the Middle Ages, which is just not for us. Our kids do count. They start playing instruments when they're wee ones. Our preschoolers are all, they've got their little claves and they've got their little blocks and they're reading the notes and they're counting. But that's just applied math. It's not a mathematical art. So unfortunately for us, we had to boot music out of the quadrivium. Go forward. Also, we don't think that our students are probably using the music that they learn in math to go forth and do anything. I've thrown some things out there, asked some people to come up with a way in which they might take the music learned, the math learned in music and use it in another application, but it's nothing unique that they're not learning in arithmetic. And honestly, why do I have to lie about it? Why do I have to say that I'm teaching it as a liberal art when teaching it for its own sake is sufficient? And we do. Like I say, 10% of our instructional time is on music. Excuse me. So astronomy, come back to where we started. Astronomy is, our heart's there. But when we say astronomy, whose astronomy are we talking about? Cosmology, astrology? Are we talking about spherics? Spherics is the place here where you are getting a mathematical art that's unique. Unfortunately, our friend Kepler led us to the knowledge that things are not working in spheres. So that had to go. We don't think, and again, I've spent 20 years doing this, I don't think that there are many people on the planet Earth who are teaching astronomy as a mathematical skill or endeavor, period, much less as a unique mathematical skill. And that's okay. They don't have to. And I don't know how you'd use astronomy for another, as the basis for another field, unless you're going into divination, which I don't want to. So in this era in which Christians are no longer engaging in astrology, I think it is a really tough sell to say that astronomy is a liberal art. And I say that as a person who can use the stars to navigate without a compass across the Pacific Ocean. So don't use the navigation one on me, right? That would not have flown with any of those guys, and it's not flying with me. That's a very unusual practical art that I'm engaging in, right? So astronomy is not a liberal art. That's been a hard one to live with at home. So instead, we're adopting something that we're calling natural philosophy, but probably that's not the right name, and we're debating this, what it should be. For us, it is a unique skill that builds upon arithmetic and geometry in the same way that rhetoric builds upon grammar and logic. We bring those two together, and we're doing something bigger with it. We're having students study the quantity, space, and shape of the natural world, which is beyond geometry and arithmetic. Our students begin with first knowing how to describe the natural world. They sort, they count, they measure, they map. Once they've figured out how to do that in the first 5 or 6 years of their education and to do it rigorously, then they move on to interrogating the natural world in a mathematical way, and finally to evaluating the large ideas that humankind has created related to the natural world. And here's what that looks like real quick. Describing starts with really superficial things: color, shape, size. It goes on to characteristics that are sort of as in time, and these things are happening in parallel with their learning arithmetic and geometry. We get those other kinds of characteristics that need to be considered: physical and chemical properties, density, which is the mother of all difficult things to teach, pH, right? You have to test for it. And then we go on to functional characteristics. I've had some lovely conversations lately with my students about why pandas are categorized as carnivores when all they eat is bamboo. It is interesting that in the world you can categorize things differently for different purposes. That's a tough thing for kids to learn. So that's where you have to start. And then we count everything. We count galaxies. We can count all the galaxies, and we have many times. And this is a picture of the Hubble Deep Field. We count the galaxies, and then we estimate the number of total galaxies that would be viewable if you looked around the entire sphere of the Earth. And then we can count them by color and by size. We count them by shape, categorizing all over the place. We can count the number of worms in our compost bin at school. We can count the different colors and the different types and the different sizes of pebbles on our beach. You don't have a beach, but you might have a beach. I hope you do. But if you don't, you have something. You have something. If you don't have any natural world associated with your classroom, you can have a fish tank, and you can count the behaviors of those fish. Whatever it is you have, your kids need to be counting it, and they need to be measuring it. Right? We measure things that are static, and we measure things that are in motion. We can go in and we can measure the weight of all of those things that went into the compost bin beforehand and then after. We can count them before and we can count them after and see how those things have changed. We can look at the sun and watch how those sunspots change and how they move in time. And we can calculate out the spin rate of the sun and that it's spinning differentially. We can get fifth graders. We've had younger kids than fifth graders do that work. They can come to understand the nature of God's universe using math. It's not what you're teaching, it's how you teach it. Right? We have students map everything, celestial things and not celestial things. Mapping where clouds are is just as important as identifying them or counting them, because where you see those cirrus clouds can tell you a lot. Where are they and what's next to them? Where are the earthquakes? Where are the birds sitting in the trees around our farm? Our school's situated on a farm. Where are the birds and what kinds of birds are sitting where? We should map it. Once we get done doing that, and you're never really done doing that, we start arguing the natural world with our students. And this framework might look familiar to some of you. Does anybody recognize this argumentation framework from? It's good, trust me. So what is a good research question? And I will tell you, not all of them are good. Right? Do plants sneeze? Not so good. Can I answer it using mathematical arts? Because not all questions can be answered that way. What type of research would answer that question? You know, if you look at professionally published astronomy, astrophysics, physics papers, science education papers, only about 1% of them are experimental in nature. There are a lot of mathematical ways of interrogating the natural world that do not involve a hypothesis. All right? Have I created a fair test? What's the difference between data and evidence? They're not the same. When you use them the same way, they're not the same way when you come to the mathematical arts. Does my evidence adequately support my claim? Is my claim related to my original question? Right? How do we use logic and our arithmetic skills now to interrogate the natural world? And then as they get older, how do we confront the big ideas related to the natural world? What is the data that has been used to support these ideas about the natural world? Was that good data? Did they use a fair test? Have they also considered the data that refutes their ideas, right? And finally, what mathematical patterns has God put into the universe, right? That moment when a student sits there and realizes that the relationships between all kinds of things have equations that look exactly the same is the moment they look at it and go, oh, God is funny. He is trying to speak to us, and he really is. So that is what we're doing in our practice. We've first taken a rule for ourselves that we have to be rigorously honest. And if other people don't like it, if our honesty makes them uncomfortable, we have to do what God wants us to do, and that's to adhere to the truth. And all these things have fallen out. And we're having a lot of fun. What we've found is that there's a lot of joy in being truthful, because now everything is an open subject to interrogation with mathematics. So I don't know if there are any questions, but that's all we have to say. Sir?
Just about music. I taught percussion for some time. I also was a music major for a little while.
I realized it was hard and went over to something else, huh?
Yeah, I could juries, nothing. But the idea that music is not, or a liberal art, it's offensive.
I know.
I'm kidding, but I'm also kind of serious.
No, I know.
There is so much math, and as a percussionist, I think of all of the different time signatures. But the point, and here I'm going to try to re-articulate it back to you so that I think I understand it right. The point is that is only useful into itself, and not applicable in any other's pursuits.
Well, let me ask you a question. When you're using math in music, and we do, right? I mean, it's tough to count out a measure if you're not using some numbers. How is that a different math than what you learned in arithmetic? Aren't you just applying arithmetic? And that's good. There's nothing wrong with applying arithmetic. I think it's great for students to look. That's how we teach music, is we say, okay, well, sometimes we'll say, well, there's 6 beats in this measure. There are only 4 counts to the measure. What are your options? Right? But that's not a unique mathematical art. They're taking their math from arithmetic and they're using it. That's very different than what they were doing in the classical period, where they were working out all kinds of classifications of harmonics and then seeking that within the human body and within the natural world. And occasionally, honestly, we use that story about them plucking the string and noticing the length did something sorry, she was zhushing. I thought she was giving me a signal. We used that story, and was it he using water in cups, or was he using pipes, different lengths, da-da-da? So what they did really was they noticed that certain notes were pretty, certain lengths of strings were pretty, and certain ones weren't. And then they looked at the ratio of those strings, and then when they went looking for that ratio out in nature. It's not like they were trying to make music out of it. The sounds, the beauty of the sounds were just their starting point. So if you go back and you look at the curriculum materials of Capella or all these kind of guys, and you look at what they meant by teaching music, it doesn't look like anything that we do. I read it, and I don't know what I read. It was complete gibberish. So I know it sounds offensive. Listen, I had to tell an astronomer that astronomy is not a liberal art. So I feel, we had that conversation for a decade. I feel how offensive it can be to a person, but it's still true. They're not learning a unique mathematical art through music that they're then going to use as the basis for other arts. Not that I can see. If you can convince me otherwise, I'm open to being convinced. However, it does not remove, it not being a liberal art does not change the fact that it's a beautiful way to train the human mind. It is a beautiful way to train our students towards orderly thinking. It changes their neurological structure inside of their brains. And it also orders their affection towards things that are beautiful. I have 4-year-olds who sit in music appreciation class with me and will listen for 20 minutes straight on the edge of their chairs watching an orchestra play. Right? With music, so a side thing for us with music that we've found that might be interesting to you guys is when we tried to play our students music that was just music, they were not interested at all. The moment they saw human beings making those sounds, they started sitting on the edge of the couch. So we're a screen-free school except for music. And all the music we play for our kids, we try to have it be real live humans performing. And our 4-year-olds can tell you if it was Beethoven or Mozart, and they can sing the songs back to us. So we know that music is extremely valuable. But it can be valuable and not be a liberal mathematical art. There are lots of things that aren't, that are of value.
I have still useful into my geometry course. There are triangles, planes, points, and whatnot.
Yeah.
And I really enjoy that. I was wondering if you had any original sources from the modern period, Newton and Descartes forward, that you feel like could be used in a similar way in a classroom.
I am so much... Oh, I'm sorry. His question was related to Euclid, and we use that in our geometry classes. I think that most classes use some piece of original Euclid. You don't have to use it all, right? That's a lot of reading to get through to get to some geometry. But did I have any more modern pieces of work in the field of geometry or in arithmetic in general?
I'm asking about Newton and Descartes specifically. So
pieces that we use in class?
Original ones.
That is not my thing, and so I cannot tell you what I use, but I bet that somebody in this room has an answer. What's something that you use from Newton or Descartes? And you mean original texts? You're looking at original documents?
Something that tracks the story of its development in a modern, not something that's an exercise in arcane notation.
Sure.
But,
Does anybody have something for him that you use?
A teacher at my school was working on geometry in that direction, but some Euclid, but a lot of geometry, a lot of just natural geometry. A lot of times Euclid in our geometry books is just reworded in a way that we can understand it quickly. And then when you read his portion down at the bottom of the page, you can see that it's elaborated.
Was he asking about the development of historical thought?
Was he asking about the development of historical thought?
We do have a teacher that has gone through some of that.
okay, thank you.
So I've been teaching, let's say, for instance, astronomy for about 30 years. And I have had a philosophical approach since the beginning that I just don't teach things that aren't true, because there's so many things that are true that I need to spend my time on that I don't have time going through everybody's old idea that we now know is not correct. And if Ptolemy were here, he wouldn't be teaching Ptolemy. He'd be like, well, that's not true. Let's move on. The same thing with Copernicus. He would have moved on. Kepler would no longer be looking for the harmonics of the spheres. He's like, it didn't work out so great. So I don't spend any time teaching ideas that have been ejected from the scientific or mathematical canon. However, I think there's a beautiful place for reading Aristotle and Ptolemy, and certainly I love reading Kepler. I think he writes beautifully. I think even through the translation, you can read such a beautiful spirit. His methodology is tight, right? He lays out his arguments beautifully, as does Aristotle. But they're just great examples of how you can go through all the right logical steps and come to the wrong answer. So I think they have a great place in logic and rhetoric classes, but I don't teach them in my astronomy class because they're not true. They were wrong. And I have too many things to cover. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I guess kind of building off of that. So like before I teach logarithms in Algebra 2, I'll go through Napier and Kepler and like look at the Rudolphine tables and how they kind of develop the logarithm tables before I ever let them get into using a calculator to calculate logs. Would you consider, I mean, would you consider that to be inappropriate to look at?
So the question was looking at Napier and Kepler looking at logarithms. So are they wrong?
No.
No, that's good then. That's good. That connects us back to a beautiful intellectual tradition, right? So there's a difference. I've taught history of science and technology before, and there are few people on the planet who loves the history of astronomy more than Timothy does. And so I think those things are beautiful and they have the right place. But for me, I think that they belong a little bit later, so that students have a little bit of a broader perspective of everything before they go back and they say, we didn't just wind up with these ideas, we had to work towards them. For me, I just have so many skills I need to teach, and I want to teach those skills at depth that I don't have time to teach things that aren't true. Not everybody agrees. Tim and I, we have a college-level astronomy textbook that we write, and it's taken me a decade. I've gotten the history of astronomy section from being this big down to being about this big, and he's right, you can't completely eject it because some people love it so much nobody would buy your book if you didn't include it. But, yes, ma'am.
Well, so you're speaking mostly, you teach at mostly grammar level, the astronomy, or are you teaching it?
So Tim and I together, and separately and together, I've taught astronomy from preschool up to graduate students.
Okay.
And I teach workshops for college faculty who teach astronomy on how they should teach astronomy as well. So it's across that whole swath.
And you never include history in any of that swath?
I had too much to do. That's just me. So we wrote the International Year of Astronomy was 2009, and we wrote the curriculum for the United Nations for that, right? And that was directed at 5th graders. So we teach it all the way along, and we do include some of those kind of things. But if you have to, for me, I've just got to make choices. I have to put parameters on what I teach, and I have to prioritize things. And so I include some history, and some of it's really interesting and really appropriate to the content, but I never teach it for its own sake, because that's a different class. And people can do, people vary on this, but that's a different class.
So my personal mantra is 5 minutes or 5 weeks. I love it, and all the different ways that the moon faces work, how the moon wobbles back and forth, and I love it. But 5 minutes or 5 weeks. You talk about the history of some of these astronomical ideas. We'll mention it for 5 minutes, but let's get on to what's really going on. Don't spend 5 weeks on history of astronomy.
Well, and that's why the whole process, I don't know if you've ever used the understanding by design process, where you really very clearly articulate your outcomes for your students. I think a lot of us do some version of that. Unfortunately, a lot of people really clearly articulate those behavioral and knowledge level kind of outcomes for students, and then we go teach what we please. A little cheating. You're supposed to articulate those outcomes and then determine how you know if your students met it, and then teach them what they need to know in order to meet those things. And if your ideas, your outcomes are large enough, it really does force you to winnow down your curriculum. We've got thousands of years of history. You can't cover it all. We have the entire universe of God's glory to help our students love. Something's got to give. And for me, it's a lot of the history that is no longer true. Because it's just a different class. I do love that stuff, but it's a different class.
as I'm understanding it, and I don't know, maybe I'm totally wrong, but the Quadrivium was kind of the pinnacle, right? It was the idea that you've climbed the top of the educational tower, you'll be fully realized when you've mastered these things, right? And they were geometry, arithmetic, music, and astronomy, right? So then, are you saying that the only two that belong there are arithmetic and geometry?
So whose astronomy are you talking about? What astronomy are you talking about when you're talking about astronomy as a liberal art?
Well, I'm wondering if the idea of all of the topics at the top of the Quadrivium necessarily needing to be a liberal art.
So then you need to change your definition of the Quadrivium.
That's kind of what I'm asking.
And you can. You're allowed. You're allowed. So I would say, these things we always have to remember that people are involved in everything. So my question would be to you, what is the chain of custody of the Quadrivium? Right, whose original idea was that? And whose hands did it go through? So if we start with Pythagoras, who ran a cult, and I don't mean a cult because it was a cult of personality, I mean a cult. And that was then passed down to the Neo-Pythagoreans, who were trying to revive the cult that had been, to a certain extent, stamped out, who were also down for the cult part of it. So you've got Nicomachus, who then translates that to Iamblichus, who then translates that to Boethius. So I'm not a cult member. So I'm not beholden to that. So why did they put astronomy in there? So this is what I'm saying about you have to interrogate your foundations. Why is this thing there? When they say you would become a fully realized, fully educated human being, what did they think you were going to know and do when you got done? Is any of it good? I'm not in the business of teaching my students to be engaged in divination or astrology or any of the other things, and that is what they were in the business of doing. So it's cool. The problem is it sounds so good, doesn't it? I get it. Arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, the numeric liberal arts, mathematical liberal arts, it sounds really good. But as soon as you start digging underneath it, you go, well, I don't like that. So, do I want to sound good or do I want to be a god? That's where the rub is. Am I willing to offend myself, my husband, and others by saying, sorry, but since we're not teaching astrology, I mean, you gotta get this, right? So if you go back and you read those original textbooks, right? If you go back and you read the original music texts that they're looking at, the conversation is about knowing whether or not the person has got an even fever or an odd fever. Because an even fever is treated this way, and an odd fever is treated this way. Now, the number 7 is the number for health. And see if this sounds familiar to you at all. This is what you've got. I'm going to give you this treatment. You should be better in 7 days. If you're not better in 4 days, or if you've gotten worse, you need to come back and see me because I've probably given you the wrong treatment. Have you ever heard that? That is straight out of the Theology of Arithmetic book, almost word for word from Hippocrates. And why is that? Because 7 is the number of health, but 4 is the foundational number. And if you've gotten to the foundation and you're not better, it's because you're along the wrong treatment. So yes, you had to know their arithmetic in order to be a doctor or to be a politician or to run the military. I mean, it is so hard for us to put ourselves back in their shoes and understand what this stuff meant to them. But as Christians who interrogate our scripture and the world that those scriptures came out of, we have the skills to do that. Is that the chirps? The chirps are telling me to go? So, but no, does saying this have does it, going down this road that we're on is not for the faint of heart, right? But following God is not either. So that's where we are. Anyway, Josh.
So to their beliefs was that, you know, the universe has some sense of order that can be described numerically, and that was imposed on it by some creative entity.
The monad,
Right?
the
Yeah.
unity, yes.
And so, yeah, that's a cult, but then there's also, like, looking back through things from a Christian perspective, like there's glimmers of truth in that we would
That's
still
right.
hold
That's-
to.
That's
So
right.
Is there, I don't know, kind of keeping the balance of like the baby in the bathwater situation of how much we throw out, how much you realize, like, actually they were on the right track. We don't want to teach it the way they taught it, but there's glimmers that we can pull from that to still be foundational for what we're teaching now.
So which track? Their religious track or their mathematical track? Because both of them were heavily flawed. It is ironic that the guy who's credited with the Pythagorean theorem would not admit square roots. That's funny. Right? So mathematically, he was heavily troubled because the only numbers they were truly interested in were numbers 1 through 9. Right? And every manifestation and every relationship that you could create with those numbers. And number 1 was not considered a number. So what are we saying when we're saying he was on the right track? And everybody knows that there's a God who created everything. I'm not going to give anybody like special credit for that because everybody knows that. He has spoken to everybody's heart, right? So yes, he said number created everything, but you know Pythagoras meant it literally. And so there's that whole conversation between, or in text, that whole argument between him and Aristotle as to whether or not numbers could literally have made everything because they have no weight and things have weight. Therefore, they cannot truly be constructive numbers. When we say number and when the Pythagoreans said number, we're not talking about the same thing. And it's really unfortunate that we use the same word for it. So they didn't mean number like you mean number. They meant a symbol that has intrinsic cosmic powers. So is that what we're holding to here? I'm not that big a fan of Pythagoras, right? All right, we've got to go. Thank you very much.